Hello there, and welcome to this next version of the Cybiant webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about how to conduct a big data maturity assessment. Before we get started, let me explain a little bit about how our webinars work. We have a couple of house rules. Please be aware that everything in this webinar is recorded. So if you missed anything at the end of this webinar, you will be sent a link where you can download and review the recording at your own time. Secondly, this webinar is interactive and you can ask questions during the presentation. Questions can be asked by clicking on the left-hand side in the questions section, and there you will be able to ask any of your questions. Because we have so many people attending the webinar today, the live chat box has been disabled, so we will discuss all of the questions towards the end of the webinar. Last but not least, at the end of your webinar, you will receive a short survey, and we will really appreciate if you could take the time to fill this up and provide us with your comments on what you thought about the webinar. We are hosting a series of these webinars, so we're also always interested to know what kind of topics you would like to see discussed next on our future webinars, and what you thought about the tools and the technology that we're using during this webinar. So that's some of the housekeeping. Let's get started with this particular webinar. Let me first take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Jan Willem Middelburg, and I work for a company called Cybiant, and we're based in Kuala Lumpur. Our specialty is big data and automation, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. What we will discuss in this webinar. On the next slide, you will see a bit of an agenda of the webinar topics that we will discuss today. I will start with providing you with an introduction to maturity models. We will discuss what a maturity model is, and especially why it's so useful for an organization to start with working with a maturity model. Next, we will make the link towards how to apply maturity models in an environment of big data. And we will especially look at how to conduct a big data maturity assessment. In the third section of this webinar, we will dive into the details of especially the components of a big data assessment. So here we will talk about things like the design methodology, what is in scope and what isn't in scope, what are the domains that are being measured during an assessment, and especially how do you measure when and how an organization is capable. Because that's what an assessment is all about. You would like to have an objective measurement that's going to be the same no matter how many times you conduct the specific assessment. After that, we'll dive a little bit into the assessment model and evaluation and validation criteria that are used to benchmark whether the scores that you get during an assessment are actually valid. In the last section of the webinar, I will discuss some of the outcomes and the results, and I will also show you an example of some of the questionnaires that you might use in order to assess this particular maturity. Towards the end, I will provide you with an overview of the white paper that we've written so that you can read all of the materials that are discussed in this webinar in your own pace towards the end of the webinar. So let's get started. First of all, the key question, and I think that's the reason why you're joining this webinar, is why should an organization consider a big data maturity assessment? Well, before we get started into that, we need to make a little bit of a link towards what is big data and what does it mean for an organization. And in the webinar that we hosted 2 weeks ago, which was called the overview of the big data framework, we discussed especially the business drivers of big data. And long story short, in that webinar, we discussed what is the competitive advantage that you can get through big data. And I think most organizations today are very much aware that data and analytics are really business drivers that can help their organization to the next stage. It can help them make better decisions. It can help them bring products faster to market, or for instance, reinvent new products and services at a faster pace than the competition. So in that sense, big data is really something that drives innovation and capability in an organization. And although most organizations today realize that that can be done and what all the benefits are, there's always a question, well, how do we get there? So in most of the work that I've been doing, and I've been in big data for almost a decade, one of the key questions I always get is, well, we know where we want to go. We already are aware that we can get this strategic advantage out of analytics and big data, but how do we get there? And I think the big data maturity assessment is one of the key models, or one of the tools that an organization can use in order to help you make those particular steps towards the future. So let's look a little bit about what that is. And let's first start with defining the term maturity. What does maturity mean? Well, if you look at management theory and management literature especially, maturity in that context means a state of being complete, perfect, or ready. And although that sounds a little bit vague, because what is a perfect or a ready organization, it means in the context of big data that you have this long-term plan, this long-term goal in which you can arrive towards the optimal situation into a number of steps. And that's, I think, why maturity is a really good word to use into the context of big data. Because most organizations start with very limited scope, very limited amount of knowledge, and they move towards more full maturity into a number of steps. And those steps are being indicated here on the slide. So we will talk a little bit more about maturity levels in the next section. But what you can already see here is that maturity evolves in steps. It's an iterative process. So with every maturity level, you take basically one step up a particular ladder. And the beautiful thing about maturity and maturity assessments is that in order to move from the first level towards the next level, you can break it down into a number of projects and or activities. So what that means is that you have a very clear indication, a very clear target goals in order to move from the lowest maturity level towards the highest maturity level. And every step has their own types of activities. So this also immediately answers the question, well, how do I get started? It's not 100% necessary to already have very advanced data analytics or machine learning algorithms right from the start. Growing towards a data-driven organization is really this iterative step. And by making small steps within every maturity level, you can slowly move up the ladder. And as soon as you realize that and you are able to break this down into those little steps, it becomes so much easier to control it. And I think that's especially what organizations like. They would like to have it broken down into smaller steps so that everybody knows what is expected of them. So that's what the term maturity means. Let's now have a look at, well, why would an organization then consider that maturity assessment? I think if you look at maturity assessments in other types of industries, in management or in projects, for example, organizations have two particular goals with executing maturity assessments. And those are no different for big data. First of all, a big data maturity assessment is used to track the overall progress. It is a snapshot at a particular moment in time of the current state of the organization. And that's also why you see the picture on the right. So basically what we do is we take a photograph of what is currently in the organization and how well or capable are we at doing things. That's the first objective of why a big data maturity assessment is done. The second reason is that based upon where we are today, we can start planning improvement projects to move towards this next level of maturity. When I first started with doing big data in organizations, I was very much overwhelmed with all the different models, tools, technologies, algorithms that are out there. But if you break it down into smaller achievable steps and go up one project at the time, you will see that you are able to make or achieve results very, very quickly. And that means that you are able to identify projects that will help you towards the next level, so that this overall end result that you're aspiring to becomes more simple and it becomes much more achievable. So this is always, I think, a very good way to explain why organizations should consider a maturity assessment. The primary reason is to make a snapshot of where you are today, but it also is an indication on where you want to be tomorrow. So what will be the future steps that you take? So those are the two objectives. The next question then is, of course, well, what is a maturity model and how can you make one that is objective? And what we will do in this next section of the webinar is discuss a number of the steps that are necessary in order to move from this initial state all the way towards the end state. And in order to explain that, I've broken down the maturity model into a number of steps. So here you see basically how we've composed this maturity model over time. And these are also the things that we will go through in the next couple of slides. We will first, for instance, discuss the scope of a big data assessment. So what is included and what isn't included. Because big data is a very, very broad topic. It's really, really big, and you really have to have a very good understanding of what is happening, what do we measure, and especially what don't we measure. So scoping, I think, is one of the most important elements into any assessment. You really need to have a good understanding of what you are doing. Based upon that scope, we have designed this particular assessment, and that's what we will discuss next. And then the next question, of course, is, well, we need to find objective data. This is really kind of a funny paradox, because in order to start with big data, we need to collect data about what you're currently doing. So that's what we do in the population. In the next couple of steps, I will explain to you how you can test, deploy, and maintain the model. And that is through the use of questionnaires and also benchmarking. So comparing your maturity towards another one. So that's what we will discuss up next. Before I explain that, we will do a very quick survey now to basically ask you a question on, have you ever already done a maturity assessment in your organization, or are you considering doing it, or have you already done it? So that's one of the questions that you should get into the screen right now. Good, I'll give you 10 more seconds to fill in the poll. And there we go. So for all the people who are participating in this webinar, none of them have actually already done an assessment. Half of them are considering to do an assessment, and the other half has never done a big data assessment. So I think that kind of shows that this is a really new topic for most people in the webinar. So that's why it's good to explain some of the more theoretical fundamentals beneath the assessment. Let's continue. Let's first then look at the scope. So scope in the context of big data is a very important topic. Why? Well, big data is a very large area of expertise. And because there's so much data out there, it becomes very, very easy to get lost and literally don't see the forest for the trees anymore. There's literally zettabytes of data out there that you can potentially analyze. And I think this is also what a lot of organizations are struggling with. They are not able to get a good return on their investments because the topic is so broad. So because of that, the first thing that we've done is that we've scoped the assessment towards very specific industry issues. So what the scope of this big data assessment will do is it will look at the current state of maturity. It will look at how to approach improvement. So based upon the things that we measure, you also get a plan towards the next level of target maturity. And third of all, it provides benchmarks. What is a benchmark? Well, benchmark is how do you compare in your organization towards other organizations. So that's what the benchmarking is all about. And if we break that down into domains, we can look at big data from a overall, or what I refer to as a holistic point of view. Because in order to do big data well, you need to have capability into a number of different areas. Big data is so much more than just buying some tools or having some data scientists employed. It really is about growing capability throughout a lot of different components of your organization. So what we use in the big data assessment is that we break it down into 6 major areas of expertise. And the key message here is that you need to have capability in all of those 6 domains in order to grow the maturity of your organization. So it all starts with defining a good big data strategy. If you don't have a strategy, you don't know where you're going, and almost every road will take you there. And this is where organizations struggle to get their return on investments because they have not clearly identified what kind of value they want to get out of big data. What that means is it is very easy to say that you want to get something done with analytics, but it's very, very difficult to define a very clear strategy on how to get there. So when we measure maturity in the strategy domain, we look at what kind of strategy documents have been defined, have people been identified and appointed towards that particular strategy, are results being measured compared to that strategy, etc., etc. So that's a domain that you really need to take into account when you start assessing the maturity of your big data organization. The second capability domain is what we refer to as big data architecture. And this has to do with the technological capability. In order to process large quantities of data, you will need to have an architecture that is able to do that. We're talking about processing large volumes of data within short periods of time. So you do need to have an IT infrastructure that is able to deal with that. And you need to have the processing capacity and the storage capacity in order to crunch those numbers in real time. So when we talk about big data architecture, we look at the technical components that are necessary for an organization in order to process those data real time. The third domain is one which, and that is the domain of algorithms. Algorithms might sound a little bit scary, but this is how do we retrieve value out of the data? Because in order to run some kind of analysis, you do need to have people who have the skills and the capabilities to determine where the value is stored in the data. So you need to have people who have specific algorithmic knowledge and are able to query through that data and retrieve the results that you're looking for. So the third domain, or the third capability domain, is what we refer to as the algorithm domain. The next domain is the process domain, and this is something that is especially relevant in larger organizations. When you're processing large volumes of data, you automatically have to do with regulatory requirements, or for example, privacy rules. If you're dealing with customer information or personal information, depending on which country you're in, there are specific rules that you need to comply to make sure that you treat that data well and that you have a process in place that governs and manages that data on a day-to-day business. So that's what we discuss in the process domains. And you need to have process capabilities and tools and metrics in place to really understand and know how to measure the maturity of your processes. So I will give you a little bit of an example a little bit later in the webinar, but that's a really important aspect, especially for larger organizations that are present in multiple countries. The fifth, and also one of the most important elements of the capability domain, is what we refer to as functions. And that is really the people component. So in order to be successful within big data, you need to have people who work in your organizations that have been skilled into that particular area. You also need to move towards a culture of data-driven decision-making. And that requires a different way of thinking. It also requires a different way of doing things. So the people element, and from what I've seen in my previous work, this is mostly one of the most difficult, but also one of the most important elements, can really make or break a big data organization. Just to give you a very simple example, you can have all the fancy technology in the world, you can have all the data very well analyzed, but if people subsequently don't use that data in their day-to-day decision making, you will never achieve the return on investments that you're looking for. Because in the end, making decisions based upon the data is really what determines success. So the people component and the culture component is as important in the assessment as anything else. You really need to make sure that you have the hearts and the minds of the people involved in order to be successful in this area. And then last but not least, the sixth domain, or the capability domain that we measure in a big data assessment, is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is always a topic that a lot of organizations are talking about, and it's a very hot topic today. But how we consider artificial intelligence is that it builds upon the foundation of all the other 5 blocks. So it's really not possible to start with the AI in case you don't have adequate processes in place. It's also not possible to do AI in case you don't have your architecture in place. So AI is the 6th capability where we really try to mimic human decision making, but that coincides with all the other 5 domains. So for each of those domains, we are able to measure how capable you are. And that's really what a capability assessment does. It measures how well you do things. And in order to do that, we use a particular objective testing methodology that can show you how the maturity arrives over time. So to summarize my previous slide, and I know I already went quite a bit in detail on that particular element, if we look at how do we measure all the different components that are necessary in order to measure the maturity of your organization, we look at 6 domains that you need in order to be successful within big data. So those 6 domains are strategy, where we look to make sure that you retrieve your return on investment. We then look at architecture, which is your technical infrastructure. We then look at algorithms. So do you have the capability to retrieve value out of your data? Then we look at processes, which is the capability to embed things systematically in your organization. We look at functions, which is the people component. And we look at AI, which is a capability that addresses the relationship between big data and artificial intelligence. So I hope that by breaking down these assessments and the overall view of what a mature big data organization is into these 6 domains, you get a bit of a better understanding of which elements are important. And the most important reason why we do this is because it will also indicate, for instance, if you score very low on strategy or architecture, where do you want to focus your efforts? Where do you want to focus those improvement projects? So those are the 6 domains that we measure. The next question then, of course, becomes, well, how do we measure? And in order to do a particular assessment, you always will need to have an assessment model. Now, there are a great number of assessments model out there in the world, most of which are very relevant towards a specific industry. So the assessment model that we've chosen, which is very closely related to other assessment models within the IT industry, is the Capability Maturity Index, which was developed by the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute and is better known as CMMI. CMMI is a 5-point capability the measurement model, which measures based upon 5 particular steps. Why 5? Well, it kind of makes sure that you can choose and you can, it becomes addressable and containable. So those 5 steps are moving all the way from what we refer to as initial capability, which really means starting out or there's not a whole lot of activity present, all the way towards optimizing. And in the context of big data, that means that you have a continually evolving process and that you use your data on a day-to-day basis in order to support decision-making. So let's run through the assessment model in a very high-level overview. You first start at an initial level. An initial level means that you know that you need to do something with big data, but you're not quite sure on which particular processes and what particular architecture you need. So within that initial step, we start to define what it is that is necessary to do to achieve the results. After that, you move towards the second level of maturity, and that's what we refer to as a repeatable process. So a repeatable process means that you do things in a particular consistent way, but it's still very much ad hoc. So you take ad hoc decisions and there's not really a long-term strategic vision on how to arrive at the results that you want to have. In order to move towards the third level, you will need to have standardized and consistent processes. And that is what will bring us to the defined level. In a defined environment, so at the big data maturity level 3, you have an established big data organization and you will use the particular processes and results to make data-driven decisions. In order to move them from the defined level towards a managed level, it also means that you have the ability to predict future results. So you have a predictable process. You make decisions constantly based on the data that is being generated into your systems. And then in the last level, in order to move from level 4 to 5, you will include this component of continual improving processes. And this is really where the system starts to learn. This is also where a lot of machine learning comes in, so that every time that you make a particular data-driven decision, the decision will become better over time. So here you see that there's a very, very consistent approach to measure where are you today versus where do you want to go towards the future. And there's 5 very clearly defined levels in which you and your organization can move from almost zero existence in terms of maturity in big data towards an optimal measurement. Key question then, of course, and that's a question I get a lot as well, how much time does it take me to move from this initial state all the way towards your optimizing state? And the answer to that is, well, it's very difficult to pinpoint an exact number, but if you count 3 to 6 months for every stage, you can do the math yourself. So typically to move from level 1 towards level 5, it takes you around 2 years to move from almost zero maturity all the way towards an optimal environment. And with every step along the way, you will need to do smaller projects and smaller activities to move towards the next level. So next question then, of course, is, well, how do we collect data and how do we measure maturity? So in order to actively measure what the capability is of an organization, we've developed a questionnaire which contains 180 questions. And that might seem like an awful lot, But we basically have broken down all of those 6 capabilities domains that we've seen earlier. And then we have devised 30 questions about any particular domain. The reason that we've done this is because some people might, for instance, have a lot of input to give in the strategy section, but not so much in another domain. So what you need to do in order to do a full assessment is really indicate which people have capability to say anything useful into each of those 6 domains. So if you have an expert who's involved in all of the 6 domains, that's the person that needs to answer 180 questions. But for most organizations, this will mean that you will need to answer between 30 to 60 questions per person. So that makes it really easy. So what I've shown you here on the slide is a couple of the questions, or some of examples of the questions that are used, for instance, and this is the example for the process of data management. So data management is one of the areas within domain number 4, which is the big data processes. And here you see some of the questions that are part of this assessment. So for instance, let's have a look at question 1. Question 1 says, in your organization, we have specified metrics and performance indicators to measure the quality of our data. And you need to answer this question from 0 or from 1 to 5, whereas 1 means, well, I strongly disagree, 5 means we strongly agree. So what that means is that an organization that really makes data-driven decisions has specified metrics to measure the quality and performance of the data that they keep and collect. If you don't have specified any metrics, that's a very good indication that your maturity level on that particular element is low. So maybe this is a good question to do with the people that are in the webinar. So next I'll send out the poll, and very similar to last time, let's do this question and see how people will respond to it. Good, 5 more seconds. Good, and I will close the poll now. So let's have a look at the results. So from the people that are part of this webinar, most people, around 50%, say that they disagree with having metrics to measure the quality of your data. That's an indication that you are still in the early stages of your maturity with regards to big data. Because if you refer to big data as a ways of achieving value, one of the key components there, of course, is that you have data that is objective and of which the quality is good. Because if you analyze data that is faulty or contains a lot of corrupt values, the outcomes of that data will also be corrupt or not correct. So this is, again, a measure on how do you measure the maturity of your big data organization. So very similar to this, there's a lot of different questions into this domain. So what we do here is that we really make sure that all of those questions are being measured one by one. And if you do that with a large enough sample, and large enough typically means at least 30 people in your organization, you will have a very good and adequate overview of what the results should be. So just to run through them very quickly, other questions would for instance, would be, do you have a function or a department that actively monitors and manages enterprise data? Do you have practices or tools in place to validate the quality of your data? And the last one, which is closely related to the people element, is do you communicate and educate your staff onto data management practices? So here, this is a short overview or a quick sample of some of the questions that are there in the big data assessment, and which you can use in order to measure that maturity overall. Of course, in this webinar, there's not enough time to go through each of the 180 questions, but I will show you a little bit later where you can get access to these kinds of materials. So now that you've collected the data and now that you've done this assessment overall over the organization, you see that you get a particular result. That result will look a little bit like the spider graph that you see here in the slide in front of you. So here you can see what the overall maturity is. This is the highest view or the highest level view. And here you can really see how an organization overall scores in terms of their maturity on big data. And what this graph immediately will tell you is, well, where are the elements that organizations can still improve. So if you look at this particular example in the slide in front of you, you can see, for instance, that this particular organization scores very, very low in terms of their strategy and also relatively low in terms of their algorithms and architecture. So that's immediately an indication that those would be the areas in which work needs to be done. And those are the areas in which you can define projects and activities, very similar to what we talked about earlier, in order to move that maturity towards the next level. The second key thing that I want you to take away from this particular graph is that maturity needs to grow overall. So it's really almost virtually impossible to have a maturity level of 5, for instance, on your processes or functions, but have a maturity level of 1 on your strategy, for example. So the objective that you need to take into account is that you want to grow each of those different capability domains evenly and consistently in the same order. So this is a very good overview of what the end results of a maturity assessment would be. And based upon this particular assessment, you can define your projects for the next stage. And then if after a year or so, you take a maturity assessment again, hopefully you will see that the maturity in every area will have grown. That's the first outcome of the maturity assessment. The second outcome is that we will look at benchmarking. So benchmarking is really an area that looks at how does our company or how does our organization compare to other companies within the particular industry or in a particular geographic region. So for all the big data assessments that we do, we will also keep and collect the data for every particular industry and every particular geographical region. So you also always have a benchmark on, well, we score, for instance, a 2.3 on big data architecture, but how does that compare with the market? How does that compare with a particular industry? So that's the benchmarking part. So that's also a result you get out of doing an assessment. So in this webinar, I provided you with a whole lot of information. So just to recap a little bit of what we've learned so far. Well, first we talked about what is a big data assessment and how can it be used. So we looked at the snapshot function and how it can be used to start identifying improvement projects. Then I've given you the basic insights of what a big data maturity model is. And we talked about the 6 capabilities of the big data maturity framework. And we looked at the 5 different maturity levels of CMMI as an assessment model. And then with the real life example, we also looked a little bit about how questionnaires can be used to collect data about the maturity of your organization and what in the end the overall results of the big data maturity assessment will be, and what the benchmarking would be. So that's it in terms of the content for today's webinar. In case you would like to have a little bit more information, because this is only a very short period of time and I fully realize that, is that we've written a white paper. And this white paper is around 6 pages, and it goes into a lot more detail about what a big data maturity assessment is and how you can conduct one. So everybody who is in the webinar today will receive an email from me after this webinar with a link towards the white paper. So you will get that in your mail after this session, I think within 1 or 2 hours. So this is something that will give you a little bit more information on how to get started. If you're really interested in order to get started by yourself, you can start with doing a big data assessment. So basically there are two ways in which you can get started with this. The first option is to do a self-assessment. That's where you will get access to all of the 180 questions, and you can send out surveys to particular people in your organization, collect the data, and execute a quick assessment in order to make sure that you have a basic baseline of the maturity in your organization. From this particular service, you will get auto-generated reports with the maturity levels for each and every particular capability. The second way that you can choose is to have a consultant-led assessment. The benefit of that is that it's independent, it's more thorough, and the results are being validated. So it's not just what the people in your organization say, but there's actually somebody who will come in and verify whether the levels that have been provided can be backed up with particular information. So that's of course also a service that we as Cybiant provide. Typically, this is a 2-week engagement in which you will get a report with the maturity in your organization, and then also an improvement plan for the next steps of that maturity over time. So if you want to have more information about that, of course, that's where you can contact us in order to look if we can work together. So I think from a content point of view, we've come to the end of this webinar. I saw a lot of questions come in during the webinar. So let's take a moment to now review and answer those. The first question that I received is, what specific department needs to take the big data assessment? Only IT or also other departments? Well, I think that's a very good question. The answer to this is also other departments. What you need to realize is that data-driven decision-making and the value of big data is really a business decision. So whereas IT can give good information and good input on the technical capabilities of the big data assessment, the elements like, for instance, strategy is more of a business decision. If you want to embed big data, for instance, in your marketing activities, the marketing department is also a department that is very suitable to be included here. So it's definitely not only an IT exercise, it should be a more company-wide approach. In the end, big data is something to gain an overall competitive advantage as a business. So you really want to make sure that the business is involved in this particular assessment as well. Hope that answers that particular question. The next question that I got is, will you get recommendations as well in the assessment report, or only a report on the current state? Well, the answer to that is easy. If you go for the self-assessment, there's no recommendations. It only explains what the current state is, because that's completely done by yourself and there's by the survey. If you choose for the consultant-led approach, then there is a roadmap and recommendations on how do you move towards the next level within the organization. So I hope that answers that question as well. The next question I received is, how many times should I do the big data assessment, and can I do a big data assessment multiple times? The answer to that, of course, is definitely yes, because I think one of the great benefits or values of doing a big data assessment is that you can take a snapshot on where you are today. And if you have that particular photograph, you can start your improvement projects over time. And if you then do the same assessment, let's say 6 months later or a year later, you can also really well showcase the results of your improvement program. So you really have a good understanding of where you were versus where you are today. And I think that's also why big data assessment is very useful from a business point of view. It shows progress. It really shows what are the things that you need to do in order to move towards the next level. So yes, I think that's it's best to do this assessment multiple times. Okay, I think if I look at the screen on the left, these were the questions that came in during the webinar. And I think that's the last one of them. Yes, it is. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I highly want to thank you for participating in this session today. I hope you found it very useful. Once again, you will receive a quick survey after this webinar. I really like to ask you to indicate which future topics you would like to see discussed and whether you found this webinar useful. Thanks again for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you on any of our next webinar series. Thank you and goodbye.